Richard took the shot glass out of Robert's hand and threw it out the window.
Steven Spielberg, I find quite confused in his recollection of me.
Hollywood remembers Steven Spielberg as cinema's great humanist, the director who turned fear into wonder, chaos into empathy, and blockbusters into modern myths. But even the most generous storytellers carry lines they will not cross. And sometimes, the deepest conflicts are the ones never shouted aloud. Spielberg rarely speaks in anger. He edits it out, which makes this story unusual. One man tested his patience, his values, and his control more than anyone else ever did. This is not gossip. It is a study of power, ego, and trust. If you value stories like this, consider subscribing. Now, let us look closer. The first collision. The tension did not begin with anger or rivalry. It began quietly, with optimism and unspoken expectations. Spielberg entered the collaboration believing talent could override temperament. But early interactions revealed something unsettling. A creative force that resisted limits. What looked like confidence slowly revealed itself as friction, setting the stage for a conflict neither side would ever publicly name. From the start, Spielberg approached the partnership with the discipline that defined his career. He believed preparation created safety, and safety allowed creativity to flourish. Early conversations were cordial, carrying the promise of shared ambition. There was excitement in the room, the sense that something meaningful could be built. But beneath that surface, Spielberg sensed imbalance. Decisions were not discussed so much as challenged. Authority was tested, not out of curiosity, but assertion. Spielberg has often spoken about how quickly a set reveals character. Spielberg once said that the first week of filming tells you who someone really is. For him, collaboration was a quiet contract built on listening. Here, listening felt optional. Where Spielberg slowed scenes to find emotional truth, this presence pushed for speed and control. What appeared decisive to some felt aggressive to others. Crew members noticed the shift before it ever reached a breaking point. Conversations shortened. Instructions became firmer. Spielberg, known for running sets with warmth and precision, began tightening boundaries. Not out of anger, but caution. He adjusted the rhythm of the production, limiting access to protect the tone he believed the film required. What troubled him most was not disagreement. Spielberg welcomes debate. What unsettled him was the erosion of trust. He has always believed ego must serve the story, never the other way around. Spielberg once described filmmaking as a shared act of faith, not a display of dominance. Here, dominance was becoming the language. Spielberg did not confront the issue publicly. He rarely does. Instead, he made a private decision. This collaboration would not deepen or repeat. He would finish the work professionally, then move on. This was the moment Spielberg learned that talent alone is never enough. Power without restraint. As success grew, so did imbalance. Spielberg led through structure, empathy, and preparation. His counterpart operated through dominance and volume. Crew members sensed the strain immediately. Authority became performative rather than purposeful. For Spielberg, whose sets thrived on calm precision, this behavior disrupted more than workflow. It challenged the idea that filmmaking was a shared act of trust. Spielberg had always believed that leadership on set was invisible when done correctly. The best direction, in his view, felt effortless to those watching. Problems were solved quietly. Confidence came from clarity, not intimidation. But as production progressed, a different style of power began to dominate the space. Instructions grew louder. Decisions were announced, rather than discussed. The room no longer felt collaborative. It felt managed. Spielberg noticed how this shift affected everyone else. Crew members stopped offering ideas. Actors hesitated before asking questions. Momentum slowed, not because of creative difficulty, but because energy was being drained by tension. Spielberg has said many times that fear is the enemy of imagination. Spielberg once said that people do their best work when they feel safe enough to fail. Here, that sense of safety was quietly eroding. The contrast in leadership styles became impossible to ignore. Spielberg prepared obsessively so others could relax. His counterpart thrived on unpredictability, using pressure as motivation. What some interpreted as strength, Spielberg recognized as instability. Control was being asserted for its own sake, not in service of the story. This was where Spielberg drew a clear internal line. He has never believed that great films come from fear or submission. For him, cinema works when every department trusts the process and each other. Spielberg once described directing as guiding emotion, not commanding behavior. Rather than escalate the conflict, Spielberg adapted. He limited interaction and protected the cast from unnecessary pressure. Production continued outwardly, but inwardly, Spielberg disengaged from the imbalance he could not correct. This was not a power struggle he wanted to win. It was one he chose to leave behind. The set that broke the illusion. Every career has a moment when professional distance collapses into personal certainty. For Spielberg, that moment arrived during production, when disagreement turned irreversible. Decisions became battlegrounds. Respect thinned. Spielberg did not argue or explode. He recalibrated. From that point forward, the collaboration existed only in obligation, stripped of any creative faith or emotional investment. The shift was not dramatic, but it was unmistakable. Conversations that once explored possibilities now ended abruptly. Creative debates hardened into standoffs. Spielberg noticed that solutions were no longer sought, only asserted. He has always believed that tension can sharpen a film, but only when trust remains intact. On this set, trust was thinning fast. Spielberg has spoken before about how fragile that balance can be. Spielberg once said that when communication breaks down, the film feels it before anyone else does. Scenes began to carry weight that was never written into the script. The atmosphere grew heavier, not because of story, but because of unresolved strain behind the camera. Rather than escalate the conflict, Spielberg adjusted his approach. He narrowed conversations, he shortened meetings, he redirected questions through smaller channels. This was not avoidance, it was containment. He understood that emotional volatility, left unchecked, would bleed directly into the work. Crew members sensed the change immediately. Spielberg remained calm and professional, but more distant. He stopped persuading and focused on execution. His priority shifted from collaboration to protection of the cast, the crew, and the film's integrity. There was no explosive confrontation, no moment that could be replayed or quoted. The realization arrived quietly. Spielberg recognized that the partnership would not evolve. It would simply end when the work was done. Spielberg once described his role as protecting the story when people can no longer protect each other. Production continued smoothly on the surface. Beneath it, the illusion had collapsed. Spielberg finished the film with precision. The collaboration itself was already over. Silence as a statement. Spielberg is known for generosity toward collaborators, past and present, which makes his silence revealing. As years passed and retrospectives grew, one absence became unmistakable. No anecdotes, no praise, no acknowledgement. In an industry where omission speaks louder than accusation, Spielberg's refusal to revisit this relationship became a quiet but unmistakable boundary he never softened. Spielberg has always been deliberate about how he reflects on his career. He revisits stories with care, often highlighting the people who shaped him as much as the films themselves. When asked about collaborators, his answers usually come easily. That is why this absence stood out. It was not forgetfulness, it was choice. Over time, the silence hardened into something intentional. In Hollywood, memory is currency. Spielberg understands that better than most. He knows when to clarify history and when to let it stand unresolved. Spielberg once said that what you choose not to say becomes part of the story. As interviews accumulated and documentaries revisited his legacy, that omission became impossible to ignore. Silence became the message. What made the silence more striking was its consistency. Decades passed, careers were reassessed, tributes were written. Still, the name never surfaced. Spielberg did not soften his stance with time. He did not reframe the relationship as misunderstood or complicated. He simply left it out of the narrative entirely. For Spielberg, reflection is not nostalgia. It is curation. He believes legacy is shaped not only by what is remembered, but by what is allowed to follow you forward. Spielberg once described reflection as choosing which chapters still deserve your voice. This chapter, he decided, did not. The silence endured because it served a purpose. It protected his peace. It preserved the rhythm of his work. In a career built on connection and trust, this absence reveals something rare. Spielberg did not need closure through confrontation. He found it through omission. And sometimes, the quietest decisions speak the loudest. Legacy versus ego. At its core, the divide was philosophical. Spielberg believed films should outlive their makers. His rival believed presence was the achievement. One valued longevity through restraint. The other pursued impact through force. Spielberg did not try to win the conflict. He stepped away from it, protecting the long arc of his work from a disruption he deemed unsustainable. Spielberg has always approached cinema with a long view. He builds films meant to age, to be rediscovered, to speak to audiences who were not alive when they were made. That requires patience, humility, and a willingness to disappear behind the work. Ego, in his world, is useful only when it serves clarity. When it overtakes the story, it becomes a liability. The opposing philosophy could not have been more different. Presence mattered more than permanence. Authority mattered more than balance. Spielberg watched as moments became performances, not for the camera, but for the room. He recognized the danger immediately. Spielberg once said that the movie should be remembered, not the noise around it. In this dynamic, the noise was steadily growing louder than the work itself. What unsettled Spielberg was not ambition. He respects ambition deeply. It was the short-term thinking, the belief that control in the moment mattered more than cohesion over time. Spielberg has built his career by trusting that restraint compounds. Small choices made carefully add up to something lasting. Force, he believes, only burns bright before fading. This realization clarified his response. Spielberg did not confront ego with ego. He removed himself from its orbit. That decision was not passive. It was deliberate. He understood that legacy is fragile, shaped as much by what you refuse as what you pursue. Spielberg once described his career as a series of choices about what not to repeat. By stepping away, Spielberg protected the continuity of his voice. He avoided becoming reactive. He preserved the rhythm audiences trusted. Ego demands engagement. Spielberg offered none. In the end, one chased immediacy. The other chose endurance. And history has a way of rewarding patience. Why this hatred mattered. Spielberg's dislike was never loud, public, or dramatic. That restraint is precisely why it matters. It marked the rare moment he refused compromise. Not out of pride, but principle. In a career defined by empathy and collaboration, this fracture reveals the limits of his tolerance, and the values he protected when everything else was negotiable. Spielberg has spent decades cultivating a reputation as a bridge builder. He listens. He adjusts. He absorbs tension rather than amplifying it, which is why this moment stands apart. It was not a clash fueled by ego or insecurity. It was a conscious decision to stop extending grace where it was no longer respected. For Spielberg, that line is rarely crossed. When it is, it carries weight. He has often spoken about the responsibility that comes with influence. Spielberg once said that how you treat people becomes part of the film, whether you want it to or not. This belief shaped his sets and his legacy. When that standard was challenged, he did not attempt to correct it through force. He withdrew. That withdrawal was not passive. It was ethical. What makes this rupture significant is its rarity. Spielberg endured difficult personalities throughout his career. He navigated pressure, conflict, and chaos without severing ties. But here, something fundamental broke. Trust did not merely erode, it collapsed. And Spielberg understood that continuing would require him to betray his own values. This was not about punishment or resentment. It was about preservation. Spielberg once described boundaries as the quiet decisions that protect your future self. By refusing to engage further, he safeguarded the emotional environment he believed great films required. He chose long-term integrity over short-term peace. In hindsight, the hatred matters because it clarifies who Spielberg is. It reveals that empathy does not mean endless tolerance. Collaboration does not mean surrender. Even the most generous creators have limits, and those limits define them as much as their openness does. This fracture did not diminish Spielberg's humanity. It affirmed it. Steven Spielberg's story here is not about conflict. It is about restraint, about the quiet choices that shape a legacy long after the noise fades. In a career built on empathy, wonder, and collaboration, this single fracture stands out because it was rare and because it was intentional. Spielberg did not escalate. He did not retaliate. He simply stepped away, protecting the rhythm of his work and the values that guided it. What this reveals is something deeply human. Even the most generous creators have limits. Even the most patient collaborators must sometimes choose distance over compromise. And sometimes, the strongest statements are not made with words, but with silence. This is why the story endures, not because of who was rejected, but because of what was preserved. Integrity, trust, and a belief that great art begins with respect. If this story made you see Spielberg differently, share your thoughts in the comments. And subscribe for more quiet truths from Hollywood's hidden history.